but quantitatively, we know the details of the main sequence and how it evolves. We have that really robustly, okay? And these last two, well, they can't go on forever, right? Galaxies, as you go toward higher and higher redshift, they can't keep getting more massive and keep getting higher star formation rates, because at some point, we actually are going to get back, if nothing else, we're going to get back into this era of initial assembly. And maybe once we do that, maybe if we see the path that galaxies are taking to get to this star-forming main sequence, maybe that'll be a way to figure out what the properties are.
Wait, why couldn't the specific star formation rate keep going up? I mean, the masses will always be small, increasingly small at really high redshift. You always have.
So I guess in principle it could, except that at some point, there's even some point that you won't have been able to collapse a cloud big enough to make stars, right?
But then you also want to make mass.
Yes, I guess that's fair. Yeah. So
It
the
should actually go monotonically.
I guess it could. Let's see, is that really right? So if it goes monotonically,
There's no evidence that it turns over so far.
So it goes to 0 divided by 0 eventually,
Yeah.
right? But yeah.
I guess that's fair. So maybe what I should say is that certainly this one can't continue forever. This one maybe could.
But even that would converge, I think, because the thing is that observation, the star formation rate, it traces a certain time scale, and so if your galaxy age is roughly that time scale, then this will be a finite number. So I would say that if you take for 100 million years as an averaging time scale, which is maybe a bit long, but your galaxy has made all the stars in this 100 million years, then you will get one number for that.
I guess that's fair. Yeah, I mean it's also the case that if you go far enough back, that at some point just the nature of star formation will change, right? Maybe you won't have enough metals to cool the gas, and you just get pop 3 stars or something like that. But I guess that's fair. Maybe what I really should say is this one certainly can't continue forever. This one, I think that's fair to say. Maybe I should say I don't know about that one. So the idea was maybe we can push this toward higher redshift. Okay. So the first thing I did on this was I was attached with a large Spitzer program called SPLASH, where we tried to push the main sequence out to a redshift of 4 to 6, because we really expected that by about a redshift of 4, and I'll show you why in a moment, but we expected that by about a redshift of 4, this ought to be breaking down. And we got over 2,000 hours on Spitzer to see what happens when the main sequence breaks down at high redshift, and got another main sequence. And when I say we got another main sequence, not just an arbitrary main sequence, okay, but if I kind of show you this plot from before with what these other main sequence measurements look like, we got exactly the main sequence that we would have extrapolated from lower redshift. So we kind of could have guessed what the answer looks like out to a redshift of 6, just based on the lower redshift observations. There's no evidence that anything's changing. Okay. And so I'll mention quickly, actually, just as an advertisement, if anybody's interested, I now have another program that's doing this that I'm leading in the Hubble Frontier Fields called Buffalo, where the idea is that we're taking the existing Hubble Frontier Fields and we're dramatically expanding the area around it in order to match the size of a near-spec pointing. So this is partly JWST prep, but the idea is we're going to really go ahead and try to push this out using gravitational lensing to magnify some of these faint galaxies and see if we can get a large sample out to a redshift of 8 to 10. And if anybody's, do you have a question?
Sorry. Oh, wait. It was about the splash, so continue on Buffalo.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay, yeah, so basically the point is that we're going to be expanding this area, and the way that we're running Buffalo is it's actually an open collaboration, so if anybody's interested in working with this data set, please talk to me about it, and we'd love to have you collaborate with us. So the point is that we're continuing to get a star-forming main sequence toward higher and higher redshifts. But actually, if we think about the theoretical side of this, maybe it should be surprising that we continue to see a main sequence out to a redshift of 6. So to do that, what we want to do is go back and think a little bit about the theoretical side. Okay, and as I mentioned, right, assembly really is something that we're not observing at this point, but we're simulating. So you've probably seen something that looks like this before, where we start with small fluctuations and gravity grows them into larger structure. Okay. Something like this, by the way, at least to me, is also an argument for studying right about this redshift range. Because if I ask you sort of what's the most interesting part of a simulation like this, right? Intuitively, at least to me, it's kind of somewhere right around here where you transition from not having a lot of stuff to starting to have stuff. And this is right around the redshift range that we're hoping to get into with the existing highest redshift surveys right now, and then the early cycles of JWST. So this is one of the reasons that I think there's hope that we're just about to get into this era of assembly.
Okay, now can I ask a question?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
So with Splash, so what does Spitzer give you that's a good star formation indicator at 4 to 6?
So the main idea is that if you do something like template fitting, if you want stellar, so photometry is going to give you a luminosity, but the main thing we're getting out of Spitzer is the stellar mass estimates from the IRAC channels, and that turns out to be much better at. Actually, I think. Sorry, if you give me one moment, I can give you an idea of where that becomes important.
So you're not actually getting the star formation rates from there. You're getting that from the UV.
The star formation rates are coming from some kind of photometric template fitting, but the idea is this is from a different survey, but it's the same idea, where essentially the addition of having sorry, this is kind of blurry. I should have done this differently, but the addition of having these extra these couple Spitzer bands that may be too blurry to see, essentially by adding IRAC both change the stellar mass estimate and give you a tighter distribution. So the idea is that basically what you're getting from adding Spitzer to these other UV data sets is much better constraints on the stellar mass, but that's really what you need to get the star forming main sequence right, because that's one of your measurements. Or maybe another way to say it is, on some level what the star forming main sequence is telling you, right? I want to say it's a tight correlation between star formation rate and stellar mass. What it's really telling you is there's a tight correlation between red light and blue light, right? And that we're hoping that the blue light is primarily reflecting the star formation rate, and the red light's primarily telling us about the stellar mass. But on some level, if I wanted to be very observational, what I could say is it's telling you something about colors in photometry. And it's telling you that if I have some small number of the colors, I can do a good job of predicting the others, and that's why there's a tight correlation. Is that kind of... I mean, I'd like to interpret this as star formation rate and stellar mass.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Okay, so the point is that we can take one of these simulations, right, and we can just pick out kind of when the halos assemble. Maybe say pick virialization or something like that. Or look at what the halo mass distribution looks like in any given redshift slice and see how that evolves, okay? And as you might imagine, what hierarchical merging does is it takes less massive halos and we can make them at higher redshift, and the more massive halos come in at increasingly low redshift, right? So what this means is you can kind of calculate around at what point you would expect to see this transition from initial assembly to main sequence-like behavior, just by kind of comparing two things. On the one hand, the most massive halo that you get is getting more massive as you go toward late times. At the same time, the most luminous galaxy you get is getting more luminous as you go backward. And at some point, these are going to meet, right? At some point, you're going to have a galaxy that kind of the most luminous galaxy that you're seeing as you go toward high redshift sort of ought to live in a halo that matches the halos that you're just making at that time. And that's around when you ought to see this turnover. And then once it, and then if you go to higher redshift, something ought to break, right? And you can get back into this era of initial assembly, okay? And roughly speaking, the most massive galaxies that we're seeing are of order 10 to the 11 solar masses in something like Splash. At least if this were in the local universe, we would expect that they live in halos that are close to 10 to the 13, okay? We don't know how to do that matching directly at high redshift because we can't directly observe something that's going to give us what the dark matter content is or what the overall halo mass is. We could do something like abundance matching, but the problem with abundance matching essentially is that it's not really a measurement, it is a matching, right? So the idea here is that we're somehow matching a predicted halo mass function with an observed luminosity function. Well, the problem is that whether or not I have the correct halo mass function, I will be able to mathematically match the two, right? And what we don't have at this point is the observational evidence that tells us if the matching is correct. Okay, the only observational evidence that we have is really a very low redshift test. Okay, well, I could take the low redshift answer and I could see what that would give us. And the low redshift answer will tell you that if I want, halos that are between, say, around 10 to the 13, maybe a little bit under, that for the most part, they're coming in somewhere in this redshift 4 to 6 range, and that was basically the reason that we were hoping SPLASH was going to see a turnover. Okay? Or maybe another way to say that is if we compare, so what I've done here is kind of to take the redshift 0 distribution, the redshift 0 matching between halos and stellar mass, and to just kind of shift it over so that we can compare the two on the same plot. So in the local universe, what we see is that this magenta stellar mass distribution, it doesn't quite look like this green halo mass function, right? And our understanding is that the reason for that is there are feedback processes that stop you from being able to completely efficiently turn all of the baryons into stars. Okay, and a couple different processes, one on the high mass end and one on the low mass end. But theoretically, what we expect is that these feedback processes, AGN feedback, for example, take some time. So the hope might be that as we move toward higher redshift, this magenta curve